Hello and welcome to the first of the question review videos. Every time we do a question, particular source question, it's very important to understand the thinking that you need to use and to apply when approaching source questions, as well as ideas around how can you conceive and understand provenance. And usually, therefore, simple statements of what you have missed or not missed sometimes doesn't teach the intrinsic thought process which is required for success. So the point of these lessons is for me to go through as the examiner and explain what is going on in this source, what are the things to consider for provenance, and what is the approach one should take when answering this question. The plan behind that, obviously, in turn, means that you can then very quickly, hopefully, learn that same thought process and get to grips and become more confident in what you are meant to do. So this is the question. Use your knowledge of poverty in the pre-war years to assess how useful source is as evidence, of the problems of urban Britain. This question, this being a 10-mark question, is asking for the strengths and limitations of this source. Now, this being the first question, there's very usually and traditionally a misunderstanding of what one means by strengths and limitations. Essentially, useful in this case means if someone was to read it, how much of a correct impression would they get about problems in urban Britain? Will they be given nothing but incorrect facts, incorrect details, and little substance, or will they be given a very clear and comprehensive list of all the problems in urban Britain? The sources always find themselves somewhere in between. So your job when approaching these sources to think, okay, what are the problems in urban Britain? So we'll go through them now, but what is always worth doing is jotting down all the things that you can think of before you even look at the source. This will keep you focused and make sure you see subtle references. So in terms of relevant to poverty, problems of urban Britain include slum residences, which are deeply unhealthy, overcrowded, and in poor crime-ridden neighbourhoods. Poor health of children, poverty of the elderly, cyclical unemployment, habitual drunkenness, social upheaval, society underpinned by misogynist and traditional attitudes towards women, poor quality food, poor quality access to work, child labour, indentured servitude, which is a posh way of saying essentially one is beholden to their employer for more than just their wages. Very often, for example, you cannot complain in jobs or move jobs because your house is owned by your employer. So what we'll do, once you've got that list, is look at the source here and work out, okay, of that list, what does the source mention? And the ones the source mentions are our strengths. And the ones the source miss, all the problems that they miss, are its limitations. So as you are looking down this source, this is a particularly easy to understand source. This is a well-selected source for this reason. The actual source you get in an exam are usually a little bit trickier to find the key arguments, the key ideas, but you can see here very quickly a very, very clear summary and list almost of the problems of urban Britain. So it talks about the physique of the poorer population and poor health, therefore you can infer from that. Poor access to quality food, which you can also infer poor low incomes. Clothing, similarly. Overcrowding and cleanliness, you can refer to slum housing, cramped housing, cramped conditions, also the rise of working class diseases like tuberculosis, which thrive, and cholera, which thrive in these overcrowded residential areas which are in urban areas. As well as this, you've got drunkenness, which we mentioned already as a social ill, the spread of knowledge of a better home management. This can both be looking at the role of women, but also the role of education and poor education. So you can derive that from that. As soon as they're exposed to better circumstances, even weaker child will survive the evil effects of infant life in poor areas. So you can talk here about high childhood mortality, which affects the area. And the fact that it mentions we recommend education, we recommend nursery, suggests that there are problems around primary education, poor education for poor people. As well as that, physical exercise again goes back down to the physical deterioration. So we have a very robust list there of things that it mentions. And what you should do is simply pick one or two of these, and that they are your strengths. This source is strong in pointing out the effects of slum neighbourhoods on the health, morality, and cleanliness almost of urban society. You quote, you develop how that quote suggests that, and then you use your own knowledge to base on that. Do that again with the second one. The limitations and stuff not mentioned: cyclical unemployment, old age unemployment. We're going to talk about crime, loose morals are not in here as well. And there are many other things which are mentioned on that list that we talked about at the start of this video, which are not there. Those are your limitations. And what we'll do is, if they have distorted or got it wrong, then you can quote. Otherwise, you'll just mention a source that fails to mention X, and then use your own knowledge to prove that it was indeed a problem. The second thing we'll be looking at is a provenance. Now, this is a very interesting source for provenance, and you can use a lot to play with here. Essentially, what you are looking to do is not simply idly state this is the provenance of the source, the nature of the source is, the origin of the source is, the purpose of the source is. What you are looking to do is simply look at the background of the source and explain how it has led to it mentioning certain things and distorting or omitting others. How has it led to it overstating, downplaying, or omitting stuff? How has it led it to being a particular focus on this? So generally what happens is, and this is easier to illustrate with limitations, this does not mention cyclical unemployment. And we might have this our limitation. This source does not mention cyclical unemployment, although it does make passing references to poor food and clothing, which implies poverty, for example. You then use our knowledge to back up how cyclical unemployment is a problem in particular areas, why that was an issue, etc., etc. You then want to link this to provenance, because we can say, well, there's a reason why it doesn't talk about cyclical unemployment. And we'll talk about the NOP from their point, and we'll look at the example in a second. We'll talk about this is not the point of the commission. What I do not want to see is this is from a government source, or this is from someone who knows what they are talking about, and therefore it is correct. That is not very good. That isn't what the source is asking. It's asking you to almost explain why this source has been so mentioned this part, but has this limitation. So this is from the Physical Deterioration Committee in 1904. And they've been set up to consider the state of children's health. Now, instantly, you've got a piece of provenance about the stuff it misses, because it's very about its very definition, very nature. It is tasked with focusing on children's health and children's health alone. That will make a lot of sense about why it misses, for example, pensioners and cyclical unemployment, which affects older people. We can also point out that it's interesting, it's the Physical Deterioration Committee, and also it's in 1904. Now, hopefully, from your knowledge, you should be hearing and sort of feeling the ringing of the national efficiency debate in this committee, and this is indeed, you can probably discern, for physical deterioration, really harking on to this idea of national efficiency. And so you can reasonably surmise that this is a parliamentary committee bouncing off concerns about physical deterioration with an eye towards improving the physical capacity of poor people, particularly poor children, in order to improve the racial aspects and health of the nation. So what we can say is, well, this is therefore going to lead to, again, focusing on young people, but also focusing on things which affect health and health alone. Because if you are talking in terms of we want an educated and a strong, physically strong society to sort of fight future wars, we don't care as much about academic education. And it's interesting that it talks about physical exercise of the children, but not academic education at the very last sentence. And we can also point out that it's going to have a lot of focus on stuff which affects health. If you look at that list again, food, clothing, overcrowding, cleanliness and drunkenness, that is all stuff which affects the health of the children themselves. Whereas it's missing, and you can really make a point that it's obviously going to be focusing on this. The reason this source is emphasising this is because this is at the heart of the national efficiency debate, and therefore these are the issues that it want, which are linked to that, and therefore it is going to mention. But it's going to miss, as we mentioned, stuff which isn't part of that debate. And also, we want to point out that this is a committee of MPs, okay, or members of the Lords as well. But this is a political body, and therefore it is obviously going to have political purposes. And every year I get a couple of first statements having a very GCSE approach by saying, well, it's official documents, so they must be telling the truth. That is not true. No one must be telling the truth. At the very least, people are always have the capability of being mistaken, let alone the unconscious, let alone conscious biases that people bring to their own interpretation of events. So, what we also care about then, if this is a political action, this is a political committee, what we're going to focus on is this idea of, okay, who's in charge? It's the Conservatives, fine. How will that affect and distort its focus? Well, the Conservatives obviously politically less state interventionist, more with a base who far enjoys the idea of the state spending money to benefit poor people even less than the Liberals do, and therefore it can't really advocate or discuss issues without its remit, outside the remit, which particularly those which cost a lot of money. So, for example, slum clearance is not mentioned here because that costs a lot. Overcrowding is mentioned, but there is no sense of in what context. Child labour is not mentioned here because, again, do you want to increase the role of the state by regulating child labour? That's not popular politically by the Conservatives, so it's not mentioned. And so by reflecting on that this is a political document, you can also got another avenue to explain why things are missing and why things are there. It's very easy to criticise drunkenness because that's a very popular political idea, and actually isn't that big a problem, if anything. Okay, but and it's relatively easy to push public education on physical ideas and public education on the ideas of drinking and medical inspection. Okay, because that isn't a good idea. But beyond that, beyond that and beyond the debate about how much money should be spent on educating poor people, you then get very divisive politically, and some people don't like that idea for various reasons. And so this report really stops short of talking about full education for that reason. So when we're looking at prominence, we're looking at several ideas. Number one, this is clearly influenced by the national efficiency debate. Okay, and therefore it's going to mention certain things and omit others. This is written in 1904. Where the debate is in full swing. Additionally, it's a Conservative Party appointed committee. Now, obviously, there are usually Liberal members and there are usually Labour Party members on committees, but the government of the day always dominate the proceedings by having a majority on a committee. So the big thing here is this is also a political document, and therefore will overplay, downplay, and overstate certain aspects and omit certain ideas, but we're more than happy to mention others if it fits within that zeitgeist, that milieu. So, this is a relatively easy source on second thought, but very often it surprises people, particularly with the provenance. Really think about the context of the source, who made it, why it's made, and how that affects it. Simplistic one-sentence analyses which conclude either it cannot say anything true or it must be entirely true do not have a place in A-level. Until next video lesson about the exam question, which will be on 1906, I will see you in due course.